As I said, many abnormal gestations cease development before a recognizable embryo forms. In fact, in our study, we were not able to identify an embryo or a fetus in 26% of the women who were threatening to abort. Here you are looking at an aborted, albeit normal, pregnancy, and you can see that its margin is characterized by this dense rind of thick chorionic villi called the chorion frondosum. There is a bald area of chorion, of course not completely bald, there are chorionic villi in this bald area, but interestingly, through the bald area you can see the yolk sac and you can see the little embryo pressed against it exactly as we see it on an endovaginal sonogram. Here is a sac that is very much larger, many, many times larger, and yet when we look inside of it, we don't see an embryo or a yolk sac. In fact, we have to look around pretty carefully to even identify any chorionic villi. These are the things that even tell us that thing is a pregnancy. Before the advent of endovaginal sonography, and even before the advent of real-time sonography, sonologists still tried to decide whether or not a pregnancy was normal or abnormal. We did this by an analysis of the appearance of the chorion and decidua and the shape and the position of the sac. Normal sacs have the following appearance. They are round or elliptical. Occasionally they are crescentic. They show the double sac sign. Chorion villus margin is thick. The chorion villus margin has high amplitude echoes in it. It has a smooth wall and it is positioned high in the uterus. So here is a sac where we don't see an embryo, but it's a very normal looking sac. First of all, it's elliptical, it's smooth, it has a thick chorionic rind, it has a bright chorionic rind, it is well positioned in the uterus, and it shows a double sac sign. That is a perfectly normal appearing sac in which we cannot identify an embryo. Many years ago, I investigated these features and was rather surprised to see that an abnormality in any one of these things had a positive predictive value for pregnancy failure of between 94 and 98%. Now that's rather striking, but nonetheless relatively useless information. No one is going to evacuate a pregnancy with a 95% probability that it's failed. When we looked at our data and decided that there were at least three, in other words, more than two minor criteria, the positive predictive value again increased to 100%. So here you see this sac. Is it a normal shape? No. Is there a double sac? No. Does it have a thick rind? No. Is the rind around it bright? No. So that's at least four minor criteria. And so one would ordinarily say previously that you could diagnose this as a failed pregnancy. The consensus conference panel, however, rejected the use of multiple minor criteria as definitive for pregnancy failure. The only criterion that is accepted is the inability to identify an embryo in the sac of a given mean sac diameter. Now, for a number of years, a criterion upon which there was general agreement was that the inability to identify an embryo in a sac with a 16 millimeter mean sac diameter predicted pregnancy failure with 100% positive predictive value. The American College of Radiology adopted this number as definitive for pregnancy failure. The British Royal College of Obstetrics and Gynecology recommended a 25 millimeter mean sac diameter, again, based on the large prospective studies I've already mentioned to you. The consensus conference panel adopted the more stringent 25 millimeter mean sac diameter criterion as definitive for pregnancy failure. At that moment, I said to the other panelists, you have just eradicated, with that decision, eradicated 25 years of my research on this issue. I published the criterion of a 25 millimeter mean sac without a visible embryo as definitive for pregnancy failure in 1986, using equipment that would be considered primitive by modern standards. That didn't convince anybody. 25 millimeters is the number. So here we have a case with a 25 millimeter mean sac diameter, no visible embryo. We can diagnose that as a failed pregnancy. Now, one of the things that I would like you to notice is how abnormal this sac is. Criteria-driven diagnostic rules make believe that there is only one finding on a sonogram, divorced from all other abnormalities. Also, generally speaking, it is unlikely that a sac between 16 and 24 millimeters mean sac diameter will ever grow to exceed 25 millimeters. Usually, sacs have all but ceased to grow under these circumstances. We can now examine the limb of our algorithm where no embryo or fetus is seen. Recall, this was 24% of the cases. We have now converted those 24% to 100% of this limb of the algorithm. Previously, we were using the 16 millimeter criterion. In our study of the 1,013 patients threatening to abort, the breakdown would have been that the 261 cases that showed no visible embryo, 45% would have been less than 16 millimeters, 55% would have been greater than or equal to 16 millimeters. When we switch to the 25 millimeter mean sac criterion, you can see that nearly all the cases without an embryo will require follow-up. If we look at it in terms of cases numerically, you can see here that there were 117 cases that were less than 16 millimeters, therefore anyone would have followed them no matter what. There were 51 cases with a mean sac diameter greater than 25 millimeters, and everyone would agree that those cases were failed. And there were 93 cases that were between 16 and 24 millimeters. Now, when we look at the total group of 1,013, that's still only 9%. So 3% on the crown rump length and 9% on the mean sac diameter means with these new criteria, we're following approximately 12% more cases than we would have previously followed. So what the consensus conference panel has agreed is that if the sac is equal to or greater than 25 millimeters mean sac diameter, it is safe to evacuate. Again, I'm not saying that that is the correct choice for a woman to make, or even a rational choice. I think anytime a woman can feel that she can go through the psychological issue of allowing the pregnancy to evacuate spontaneously, she avoids the chance of having a new scar placed in her uterus by suction curettement. So, the consensus conference panel says these are the findings which confirm a failed pregnancy. An embryo without a heartbeat of 7 millimeters or more, no visible embryo when the mean sac diameter measures 25 millimeters or more. These changes affected approximately 12% of the cohort of 1,013 patients that were threatening to abort. Therefore, while I personally consider these changes to be excessive, they affect a relatively small number of patients and do have the potential to avoid errors. For these reasons, I was a signatory of the consensus conference recommendation.